From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think everyone's judged on their whole life. I'm a good person. I've led a good life. I've tried to do a lot of good for a lot of people.
At least 128 people are arrested protesting Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh Monday, who's been accused of sexual assault by two women, as Kavanaugh and his wife sat down for an unprecedented interview on Fox and denied the allegation. We'll get response from Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, who helped call for the national walkout. We'll also speak with independent journalist Marcy Wheeler about accusations against Kavanaugh and the drama that unfolded Monday when it appeared Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had resigned.
For about 2 hours, we didn't know whether we had an acting attorney general overseeing the Mueller probe. And that freaked everyone out because we assumed that the probe was dead. Tune in Thursday to see whether Rosenstein gets fired and whether Brett Kavanaugh talks about using cigars as a sex toy.
Then to Puerto Rico, as President Trump denies Hurricane Maria and its aftermath killed thousands. He also says he won't support statehood for the island as long as the San Juan mayor is in office.
With a mayor of San Juan as bad as she is and as incompetent as she is, Puerto Rico shouldn't be talking about statehood until they get some people that really know what they're doing. With people like that involved in Puerto Rico, I would be an absolute no. If you had people like the mayor of San Juan, whatever her name may be, she is a horror show.
We'll get response from Naomi Klein, who says there's nothing natural about Puerto Rico's disaster. Her book, The Battle for Paradise, Puerto Rico Takes on the Disaster Capitalists. She's now a professor at Rutgers University. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 128 people were arrested on Capitol Hill Monday protesting Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, who's been publicly accused of sexual assault by two women. Bob Bland, co-president of the Women's March, helped organize the mass civil disobedience.
Women from all over the country have come to Washington to put their bodies on the line, to say, we will not go back, we believe survivors, and to say, look at all of the thousands of women and allies who are here today. Women are to be believed, to be trusted, and we will always come out for each other because we have each other's backs.
On Monday night, Brett Kavanaugh and his wife sat down for an interview with Fox News. It was his first public comment since Dr. Christine Blasey Ford accused the judge of attempting to rape her when she was 15 years old. He 17. Kavanaugh denied the allegation.
No, I've never sexually assaulted anyone, not in high school, not ever. I've always treated women with dignity and respect.
He would not answer the question whether the FBI should investigate. Both Kavanaugh and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford are scheduled to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday. A second woman, Deborah Ramirez, has accused Kavanaugh of exposing himself and thrusting his genitals in her face during a college party in a dorm room at Yale. In addition, attorney Michael Avenatti says a third woman will come forward before Thursday with new evidence against Kavanaugh. We'll have more on this story after headlines. Deputy U.S. Attorney General Rod Rosenstein was at the center of attention Monday as rumors swirled that he was about to resign or be fired by President Trump. But for now, Rosenstein still has his job. He's scheduled to meet with President Trump on Thursday, the same day that the Kavanaugh-Ford hearing will take place. This comes days after the New York Times reported Rosenstein had suggested secretly recording President Trump in the White House and recruiting cabinet members to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office for being unfit. Rosenstein oversees special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. He called the New York Times report inaccurate and factually incorrect. Some have said his remark about wiring the president was sarcastic. The Dallas Police Department has fired the white police officer who shot and killed a 26-year-old black man in his own apartment. The officer, Amber Geiger, entered Botham Jean's apartment and opened fire, killing him on September 6th. Police claim the officer believed it was her apartment. While Geiger was charged with manslaughter after the shooting, she remained on the police force until Monday. The announcement of her firing came on the same day Botham Jean's family buried his body in his home country of St. Lucia. In news on Hurricane Florence, a new study says rising sea levels in the Carolinas fueled a stronger storm surge, leading to far more destruction in the region than would have been otherwise possible. Researchers are estimating sea level rise over the past 5 decades led to 11,000 homes being damaged that would not have suffered damage previously. Stephen McAlpine of the First Street Foundation said, quote, "Even though the impact of Hurricane Florence continues to be felt, we already know that sea level rise has made the damage significantly worse, as observed with other recent storms." Data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on tides for the Carolinas shows an average rise in sea level of about 6 inches since 1970. Climate change is expected to result in even greater sea level rise in the coming years and decades. The Carolinas are still suffering from flooding. At the United Nations General Assembly, President Trump met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in on Monday. The meeting came just days after Moon wrapped up a 3-day summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. President Trump said he expects to meet again with Kim soon as well.
We'll be having a second summit with Chairman Kim in the not-too-distant future. Secretary of State will be dealing with that subject, but Mike Pompeo has been in touch with them, and we've been in touch with them, and I think within a pretty short period of time that'll be announced. It will be location to be determined, but we're both very much looking forward to having it.
Meanwhile, President Trump announced on Twitter this morning he would not be meeting with the president of Iran during the UN gathering. Trump wrote, quote, "Despite requests, I have no plans to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I'm sure he's an absolutely lovely man," unquote. Over the weekend, Iran blamed the United States for being behind an attack that killed 29 people during a military parade in the city of Avaz. Trump is addressing the UN General Assembly today. In news from Syria, Russia's announced plans to provide Syria with an advanced S-300 missile defense system. The move comes just days after Syrian missiles accidentally shot down a Russian military aircraft, killing 15 crew members. The downing occurred as Israeli jets attacked targets in Latakia province. Israel and the United States decried Russia's move, describing it as a significant escalation to the war. Meanwhile, top Trump administration officials are saying U.S. forces will remain in Syria for the indefinite future. National Security Advisor John Bolton told the Associated Press Monday, "We're not going to leave as long as Iranian troops are outside Iranian borders, and that includes Iranian proxies and militias," unquote. Secretary of Defense James Mattis also confirmed U.S. troops would be staying, but said their focus remains on fighting militants tied to ISIS. In news from Mexico, a newspaper journalist in the southern state of Chiapas has been assassinated after reporting on corruption involving a local member of Congress. Mario Gomez Sanchez becomes at least the 9th journalist killed in Mexico this year. He was killed on Friday when 2 attackers on motorbikes approached him and opened fire. Meanwhile, in Guatemala, another indigenous rights activist has been killed. Juana Ramirez Santiago, who worked as a midwife and helped found the network of Xil Women, was shot dead Friday. She's at least the 21st human rights activist to be slain this year in Guatemala. The Trump administration's moving toward overturning an Obama-era safety rule that required trains carrying oil and other flammable material to have a modern electronically controlled braking system. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration is arguing such a braking system would be too expensive. Such trains are sometimes referred to as bomb trains because of the danger they pose to local communities. In 2013, 47 people died in Quebec when a runaway train carrying volatile crude oil from North Dakota's Bakken Shale exploded. Since 2010, there have been at least 20 derailments in the United States and Canada involving trains carrying oil and ethanol. In news from Florida, a Democratic congressional candidate has died of a suspected heart attack. April Freeman was 54 years old. She was running to fill the seat of retiring Republican Congressmember Tom Rooney. And the winners of this year's Right Livelihood Award have been announced. The prize is widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. This year's winners are anti-corruption champions Thelma Aldana of Guatemala and Ivan Velázquez of Colombia. 3 imprisoned civil and human rights defenders from Saudi Arabia, Abdullah al-Hamid, Mohammed Fahad al-Khatani, and Walid Abu al-Khair. Also, a farmer from Burkina Faso named Yakuba Sawadoga, and the Australian agronomist Tony Rinaldo. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to new accusations of sexual assault against President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, and the growing resistance to his confirmation. At least 128 people were arrested on Capitol Hill Monday protesting Kavanaugh, who has been publicly accused of sexual misconduct by 2 women, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and Deborah Ramirez. This is Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, who called for the National Walkout Monday in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence.
Dr. Blasey Ford, like Professor Anita Hill before you, we applaud you and your courage. We stand with you, and we will not let your labor be in vain.
In a minute, we'll be joined by Tarana Burke in D.C. On Monday night, Brett Kavanaugh and his wife sat down for an unprecedented interview with Fox News. It was his first public comment since Dr. Christine Blasey Ford accused the judge of attempting to rape her when she was 15 years old. Kavanaugh denied the allegation.
We're looking for a fair process where I can be heard and defend my integrity, my lifelong record of promoting dignity and equality for women, starting with the women who knew me when I was 14 years old. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to let false accusations drive me out of this process. I have faith in God, and I have faith in the fairness of the American people. The truth is, I've never sexually assaulted anyone in high school or otherwise. I am not questioning and have not questioned that perhaps Dr. Ford at some point in her life was sexually assaulted by someone in some place. But what I know is I've never sexually assaulted anyone.
Both Kavanaugh and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford are scheduled to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has dismissed the allegations against Kavanaugh and said the full Senate will vote on his confirmation, irrespective of what this week's hearing reveals.
Clear, Mr. President. Judge Kavanaugh will be voted on here on the Senate floor. Up or down, on the Senate floor, this fine nominee to the Supreme Court will receive a vote in this Senate in the near future.
Even as Kavanaugh defended his integrity, the New York Times published a report on how he and his high school football teammates boasted in their yearbooks about sexual exploits at a nearby Catholic girls' school and described themselves as the Renati alumni in a reference to Renati Schroeder, then a student at a nearby Catholic girls' school. Schroeder responded to the report saying, quote, "I learned about these yearbook pages only a few days ago. I don't know what Renati alumnus actually means. I can't begin to comprehend what goes through the minds of 17-year-old boys who write such things, but the insinuation is horrible, hurtful, and simply untrue. I pray their daughters are never treated this way."
Even before this report was published, the New Yorker magazine published an account Sunday from a second woman accusing Kavanaugh of sexual assault. Deborah Ramirez was a student at Yale University with Brett Kavanaugh and said he exposed himself to her during a drunken dormitory party and thrust his genitals in her face. The New Yorker later updated the story with comments from two former classmates of Kavanaugh's, Louisa Gary and Dino Ewing, who initially signed a statement of support for Kavanaugh that was provided by his attorneys. They approached the New Yorker after the story was published and asked that their names be removed from the statement, saying they did not wish to dispute Ramirez's claims. New Yorker reporter Jane Mayer later tweeted, quote, FYI, this means only 4 classmates are keeping their names on a statement disputing Ramirez. 2 are implicated in the incident, according to her, and a third one is married to the guy who she recalls saying kiss it at the party, unquote. Meanwhile, Monday night, lawyer Michael Avenatti said he has multiple clients and at least one is prepared to come forward publicly within the next 48 hours with additional allegations against Kavanaugh. For more, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, who called over the weekend for a national walkout Monday in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence in the wake of the allegations against Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Tarana established the Me Too organization in 2006 to focus on young women of color who've endured sexual abuse, assault, or exploitation. She's now senior director at Girls for Gender Equity. Here in New York, Marcy Wheeler is with us, independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website emptywheel.net. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Tarana, let's begin with you. 128 people arrested protesting Judge Kavanaugh and his nomination to the Supreme Court outside many different senators' offices, including Senator Collins of Maine. Can you talk about what happened this weekend, why you called for this walkout and protest on Monday?
Hi, yes. Hi, thank you for having me back again. We thought it was really important to have a show of support for, initially when there was the arbitrary deadline set for Dr. Blasey Ford to come forward and make a decision about whether or not she was going to testify. We certainly, myself and many of the other organizations that signed on to do this action on Monday, thought it was really important that we came out in a show of force and support for her. And not just for her, but this has been a hard week for survivors of sexual violence around the country. And we needed to do something to show survivors in general that we stand up and we support each other, because most of us are survivors who called for the march, that we support each other, that we will stand up in the face of this treatment, and that we won't see the same thing that happened to Anita Hill happen again.
Tarana Burke, were you surprised by the turnout, not just in D.C., but around the country to your call? And also, could you respond to this questions that have been raised by some in the Senate about why these women that are raising these allegations took so long to come out and raise them?
Absolutely. Just first, I'm always pleasantly surprised when people show up the way they did. And yesterday in D.C. was a gloomy, rainy day, and we had probably close to 1,000 people join us in the Senate and then march to the Supreme Court and stand in the rain, listening to people talk about why this moment is so important and why us standing up and standing together is so important. So yes, I was so pleasantly surprised at the turnout. So many people showed up via social media. There were actions in New York and in California and in other places around the country that I think show just how important this issue is to so many of us. This is a time for us to not just show up via a viral hashtag, but in person with our feet to the street to say that we won't be treated this way and we won't stand for another survivor to be treated this way.
I'd like to go back to the specific comment that President Trump made that led to the hashtag Why I Didn't Report. Trump tweeted early Friday, quote, "I have no doubt that if the attack on Dr. Ford was as bad as she says, charges would have been immediately filed with local law enforcement authorities by either her or her loving parents. I ask she bring those filings forward so we can learn date, time, and place," Trump said. Republican Senator Susan Collins from Maine, a key vote in Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination, was later asked to respond to Trump's tweet.
I was appalled by the president's tweet. First of all, we know that allegations of sexual assault, I'm not saying that's what happened in this case, but we know that allegations of sexual assault are one of the most unreported crimes that exist. So I thought that the president's tweet was completely inappropriate and wrong.
That's Maine Senator Susan Collins. Tarana, would you like to respond?
Absolutely. I thought that the tweet was so insensitive, and the reason why you saw such a fierce and quick backlash to it on the internet is because it touched a nerve with so many survivors of sexual violence and allies and supporters. As the senator said, we know that sexual violence is severely underreported, and it's also condescending, right? It's like he's putting out this tweet with this false sense of, well, her loving parents would have reported this incident. We're talking about a 15-year-old girl at a party with older boys 36 years ago who probably left that party feeling shameful, feeling confused about what she experienced, and any number of emotions that would cause her not to report the incident. And that's why so many people came forward to talk about their own reasons for not reporting, including myself. There's so many things that are attributed to the survivor in cases of sexual violence that to say something like that just shows his deep insensitivity. But it also shows what is a widely held belief about sexual violence in this country. And I'm not glad that he said it at all, but it did give us an opportunity to push back and sort of educate the public about the realities of what it is to be a survivor of sexual violence.
Well, the hearing that we'll be seeing on Thursday in the Senate Judiciary Committee harkens back to the Anita Hill hearings and against Clarence Thomas when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. Do you think much has changed, or what in your view has changed in the country since then?
You know, it's really shameful. I was a freshman in college during the Anita Hill hearings, and I remember it very, very well. It left a mark on me as a young woman, a young black woman, and it's really shameful for America. It's not our shame. I think it's really shameful for the United States government that we are back here 27 years later with little evidence that anything has changed. I mean, you have some of the same people, the same Orrin Hatch, who was on Anita Hill's, the Senate Judiciary Committee during Anita Hill's hearing, saying some similar things, talking about Dr. Blasey Ford must be confused. It really is sad that we haven't learned enough in this country. And this is why Me Too took off. This is why I Didn't Report took off, because there really is a gap in the understanding of the life cycle of survivors of sexual violence widely across, I think, in the pop culture in general, in the country in general, but certainly in our government.
I want to go to Media Matters senior fellow Matthew Gertz, who tweeted on Monday. He was talking about William Schein. He said, quote, White House comms director accused of covering up sexual misconduct at Fox chooses Fox host who defended network's leading perpetrator of sexual misconduct to interview SCOTUS nominee accused of sexual misconduct, who is picked by president accused of sexual misconduct. That is the tweet. William Schein, the current White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications, former co-president of Fox News. Let me bring Marcy Wheeler into this discussion at this point to respond to this and this unprecedented moment where where the Supreme Court nominee sits down with his wife, Ashley, for a Fox interview. Interestingly enough, when the interviewer asked him, would you call for an FBI investigation, of course, he skirted this.
Well, actually, the interviewer asked his wife first, and he interrupted and didn't let her answer and skirted the answer. So it's another example where It's not sexual assault, but it's a clear sign that he doesn't respect women. He doesn't want women to have their own autonomy to answer the basic questions.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, going to the issue of an investigation. If he, as he said throughout, this never happened, why not say, sure, let the FBI investigate. It'll just prove my point.
Well, the other thing is he kept repeating over and over again, I've never committed sexual assault. I really feel like we're headed towards a what's the definition. It depends on what the definition of sexual assault is. Just, you know, as Clinton tried to get away with, it depends on what the definition of is, because I can imagine him saying, well, sticking my penis in a woman's face is not sexual assault because no vaginal contact happened. Is that what he's thinking? Is that where we're going?
I mean, I want to just ask one question of Tarana Burke following up on that. There's this unbelievable moment in this interview where the interviewer asks him about how long he was a virgin. And this is now, people are laughing about this, saying this is what this has all come to. What does that have to do, Tarana Burke, with whether or not he sexually assaulted somebody?
Nothing. It has nothing to do with it. Whether he was a virgin or not, what Dr. Blasey Ford accused him of is absolutely what she described is sexual assault. It has nothing to do with whether he had had actual intercourse with somebody else or not. And as a matter of fact, and I don't want to dig into, you know, psychological things in his personal life, but you were in a high school with highly privileged other people. There are lots of accounts from his best friend of drunkenness and parties and things like that. I could see a 17-year-old virgin trying to prove themselves to be like his boys and doing something like Dr. Blasey Ford described. So the whole question about him being a virgin during this time means that he didn't commit sexual assault is incredibly not relevant to this moment. And I agree with the other guest that said that. Marcy Wheeler, I'm sorry. I agree with you about, I think we're going down a dangerous road of what is sexual assault and answering these questions just based on how he answered last night.
Marcy, I'd like to ask you in terms of the movement now of the Senate Judiciary Committee to have this hearing on Thursday. What's the rush? Given the fact of, as many people have said, that the Senate waited a full year and didn't even give a hearing to Merrick Garland when President Obama named him. What is the rush in getting this hearing done and a vote done, as Mitch McConnell hopes this week?
Well, one of the rushes is that we know the Republicans are learning of additional allegations as they're rushing things forward. So they're trying to get a hearing in, a vote done before another allegation and another allegation and another allegation comes forward, because we're close to 4 at this point. If those become solidified, it becomes a very different issue, both for whether Kavanaugh becomes the Supreme Court justice, but also what his future is on the D.C. Circuit.
So can you, Marcy Wheeler, you've been following all the Kavanaugh hearings very closely, and what this all means at this point. This new hearing is set for Thursday. Mitch McConnell says they want to vote in the committee on Friday, and you heard him say he's going to take this to the floor of the Senate. You have Orrin Hatch, who served on this committee and Anita Hill's committee, saying he will support Kavanaugh no matter what. It doesn't matter what Dr. Blasey Ford says. Your thoughts on just where this is headed, and this being just 5-6 weeks before the midterm elections?
I think it's a game of chicken between Mitch McConnell and Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, because both of those women appear to be taking these allegations very seriously, as well as the rest of Kavanaugh's record. I mean, there are other parts of Kavanaugh's record which are troublesome. He still won't say what he defines as abortion, whether he defines birth control as abortion, for example. And I think that goes to the issue. He refused to look in his emails to see whether he had received sexually explicit emails from Judge Kaczynski. So
Judge Kaczynski, the judge who was forced to retire last December,
a longtime mentor of his, and so
because of
sexual harassment. So He was asked repeatedly, were you party to these sexually explicit emails? And he just obstinately refused to even look.
But he came up with a calendar from 1982 when he was in high school to prove he was not at a party on a certain date that Dr. Blasey Ford never said a date.
Right, and won't look at emails from last year. So I think these things are all becoming an issue, and if McConnell moves it to the floor of the Senate immediately, then the focus becomes those two women and whether they're going to vote against Kavanaugh and against their party to defeat this nomination. And again, it's a rush. I think that they are trying to rush out ahead of other allegations. I think they're trying to rush out before we take a step back and put the entire picture together. Because, again, these sexual assault allegations are very much a party with other pieces of evidence that Judge Kavanaugh both doesn't respect women and doesn't tell the truth.
Finally, if Kavanaugh doesn't get the nod to be Supreme Court Justice, he remains on the federal bench. Should he be impeached?
I think we're going to hear those questions going forward, particularly depending on what happens in the election and whether Democrats take the House and Senate.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us. Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, usually in New York, but now in Washington. She participated in the mass protests against Brett Kavanaugh in Washington. But they were not only there, they were all over the country. Marcy Wheeler, we'd like to ask you to stay with us to talk about Rod Rosenstein, another major controversy that's brewing. Marcy Wheeler with EmptyWheel.net. Then we'll be joined by, well, now Rutgers University professor Naomi Klein, to speak along with Juan Gonzalez about what's happening in Puerto Rico right now and President Trump's latest comment that he won't support statehood until the San Juan mayor is out. Stay with us.
We need to talk about Addie Mae. I seen her walking out the other day, and I've been watching that girl well too. Bruised back and blistering, there ain't no end to her suffering, and an acre she had is gone to gray. It's a howling shame, a howling shame. Across we go, burning in a hell that don't nobody know. White flag twist.
Howlin' Shame by Adia Victoria. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to the drama that unfolded Monday when news outlet Axios reported that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had verbally resigned amidst mounting tension over the investigation by Special Counsel Robert Mueller into Russia's role in the 2016 presidential election. Some of the confusion began last week when Rosenstein and White House Chief of Staff John Kelly met at the White House hours after the New York Times reported that Rosenstein had suggested secretly recording Trump in the White House and discussed recruiting cabinet members to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office for being unfit. But for now, Rosenstein still has his job. White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders tweeted Monday that Trump and Rosenstein, quote, had an extended conversation to discuss the recent news stories. Trump, who's in New York for the UN General Assembly, told reporters he would meet with Rosenstein on Thursday when he returns to Washington.
No, I'm meeting with Rod Rosenstein on Thursday when I get back from all of these meetings, and we'll be meeting at the White House, and we'll be determining what's going on. We want to have transparency, we want to have openness, and I look forward to meeting with Rod at that time.
Rosenstein has denied that he ever planned to record Trump or Wade invoking the 25th Amendment. He called the Times report inaccurate and factually incorrect. Some have said his remark about wiring the president was sarcastic. To talk more about this and what it could mean, we are continuing with Marcy Wheeler. What does this mean for Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation, which Trump has called a witch hunt? Marcy Wheeler is an independent reporter with EmptyWheel.net. Explain what took place, what unfolded.
So New York Times story comes out, makes these claims, leaves out key details such as that this discussion, whether it happened or not, happened after, for example, Trump admitted firing Jim Comey because of the Russian investigation, gave the Russians Israeli intelligence, had a chummy meeting with the Russians with no U.S. press there. And then this whole furor comes out of whether or not Rosenstein is going to be fired or not. Some discussion of that Friday between John Kelly and him. Monday morning, something we've seen in the past from John Kelly, which is reports coming out that somebody has resigned in an attempt to stave off a firing. And that's critically important in the case of Rosenstein. And the press picks it up as if he's already resigned, and then reports from DOJ saying, no, he'll be forced to be fired. What happens is, of course, Rosenstein is overseeing Mueller's investigation. He gets to sign off on indictments. He gets to sign off on the scope of the investigation. And if he is fired, then it's not entirely clear who becomes Mueller's boss. Probably it's the Solicitor General, but it might be the OLC head.
Because Sessions has recused himself.
Because Sessions has recused himself. Or Trump could then fire Sessions and, rebuild his entire DOJ around getting out of this investigation. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. But the key point is, if Rosenstein resigns, Trump has more flexibility about who oversees Mueller. If he is fired, then
if he resigns, he can hold. He can put in someone for 8 months without them being approved by Congress. But if he's fired,
then you go to the line of succession. So then you have the very conservative Solicitor General, who's not a big fan of special counsel investigations, but who does believe that under certain circumstances the president can be criminally investigated.
But then there are questions as to whether the Solicitor General would have to recuse himself. Why?
Because he worked for the Trump campaign, Jones Day. So there's a conflict with Trump's one-time defense attorney and with the Solicitor General's pastime. So then it would go to the OLC head.
But now you've also tweeted that Robert Mueller, who appears to be one step ahead of everyone, may have already factored this into what might happen and may already have developed a plan for rolling out future indictments.
Yeah, I mean, three things. One is they have known that they're under threat of this happening for a year. And therefore, it's clear they are thinking about succession patterns. We've seen Mueller kind of handing off parts of the investigation, whether indictments that have already been taken are sent off to other prosecutors. Michael Cohen is now cooperating with Mueller, but also with SDNY, the federal prosecutors here in Manhattan, and also with New York State. And all of those are investigations that would target Trump, and only the Mueller investigation would be affected directly by a Rosenstein firing. And then the question you got to ask is, if you could decide who would make better use of a 3-day warning that Rosenstein was going to get fired, would your money go on Trump or would it go on Robert Mueller? I mean, he's got 3 days to put into place plans of what's going to happen if Rosenstein is fired on Thursday. I think that once Mueller got Paul Manafort's testimony locked in, which happened about 10 days ago, I think to some degree it was too late for Trump to really completely undermine this investigation.
And do you think he did that because he was afraid something like this could happen?
Well, I think the timing of that was largely dictated by Manafort's second trial coming up. And by whatever else the prosecutor showed him about what was coming down the pike on the conspiracy case in chief. But regardless, back in January, Trump was telling people, I'm safe because Paul Manafort is not going to flip on me. Paul Manafort has now flipped on him. And so it may be too late for Trump to, short of shutting down the entire DOJ, it may be too late for Trump to completely avoid, if not him, then people like Don Jr. and Roger Stone being in serious trouble. If
Rod Rosenstein leaves the DOJ, the person who would likely supervise Special Counsel Robert Mueller is the Solicitor General Noel Francisco, a Republican lawyer who once worked with Ted Cruz on the legal team supporting President George W. Bush during the 2000 Florida recount. Francisco's old law firm, as you said, Jones Day, now representing Trump. He's been described as a Trump loyalist, a skeptic of the FBI. In 2016, he co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal shortly before the election that accused the FBI of using a double standard for dealing with Democrats and Republicans, saying it was conducting, quote, ambush interviews, immunizing only witnesses who can help deliver convictions, and investigating and charging all potential crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, Mueller is probably far enough along such that Francisco can't decide the scope of where you're going. Mueller's already kind of spinning off parts of the investigation and, importantly, spun off both Greg Craig, a very senior Democratic lawyer, and Tony Podesta for investigation here in New York. And so it's not like Mueller is sparing the very, very prominent Democrats that come in his path either. I think that there certainly will be questions going forward if Rosenstein is fired. But don't forget, I mean, Rosenstein is himself a very conservative person. He knows Brett Kavanaugh from back when they worked on the Starr investigation together, the Whitewater investigation. So it's not like we're dealing with any screaming liberals here. These are all conservative people, and I think, all will do things to prevent a runaway investigation, but I'm not clear that they're going to overturn a very well substantiated prosecution, and that seems to be what Mueller is running. And
what about the person who was supposedly the top law enforcement person in the land, Jeff Sessions, in terms of what he would do in the eventuality of Rosenstein leaving or being fired? Because he has said in the past that he would guess that he could not stay on if that happened with Rosenstein.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody on all sides are sort of, and I've actually heard this from a pretty senior Republican, everyone's just trying to get through the midterms. And I think everyone expected that Rosenstein would be fired shortly after the midterms. Trump didn't want to do it before the midterms because it would dramatically affect the elections. And he may not fire him on Thursday. We'll see, for that reason, because it will make Trump look more guilty as we go to the polls in November. But I think that, Mueller has always been 4 or 5 steps ahead of certainly where Trump is. And I do think that his investigation is at a point where, yes, I mean, the president has a tremendous amount of power. So, yes, he could find a way to shut that investigation down. But the steps he would have to take at this point to do so are going to be such that, particularly if he takes them before the election, there's going to be some significant political repercussions, aside from everything else that's going on.
When you started by saying, that report in the New York Times, which you're referring to Friday night about Rod Rosenstein that has led to all of this, but you just said that report in the Times. I thought you were talking about that report not actually in the New York Times, but the New Yorker on Sunday night. And the reason is, and that, of course, had to do with Kavanaugh, you have the second person accusing Kavanaugh of sexual assault. And on this day, you have this chaos. You don't know if Rosenstein is resigning, if he's fired, if he's called to the White House. And then Trump, they say that Rosenstein, this will all culminate on Thursday. Of course, that is the day of the Kavanaugh-Ford hearing, that Trump will come back from being here in New York. He's giving his UN General Assembly speech today. And he will come back Thursday and have this meeting with Rosenstein. And it has succeeded in at least dividing the news on all of the networks. It would have been 24 hours a day on Kavanaugh, which he couldn't stand. And now Avenatti says another woman is going to come forward. And now you've got this Rosenstein thing, which may not lead to something on Thursday.
Right. And I mean, that's Trump's only way of managing things that he can't control is creating this press chaos, right? There's an entire day between here and Thursday, and who knows? I mean, Michael Avenatti says that the next victim is going to come forward on Wednesday. But it's also not clear. I mean, ultimately, the Kavanaugh thing comes down to Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. And Collins has come close to saying, I'm really close to making a decision.
Even Jeff Flake wouldn't, and he's on the committee.
Right, he's on the committee,
committee.
and I've heard of at least one other Republican who's not necessarily a solid vote for entirely different reasons. So
who is that?
I'm not going to say, because then Republicans will go after him. It's a male senator who is no one's talking about. But you know, I think that we'll see whether Thursday really matters anymore. There may, you know, if more victims come forward, if more Republicans come out and say, we've heard too much about this candidate, and we need somebody who can be trusted by the American people. Who knows? It's a whole day away, and given the news cycles these days, that seems like an eternity.
We'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much for being with us, Marcy. Marcy Wheeler, independent journalist who covers national security and civil liberties, runs the website EmptyWheel.net, usually in Michigan, today in our New York studio. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we'll talk about Puerto Rico. On this first anniversary of Hurricane Maria, President Trump still denies the number of people who died and now has added a new comment in the swirl around Puerto Rico. Stay with us.
No es demasiada la casualidad que grandes cosas pasen cuando vivimos en hermandad. Se sorprendió hasta la naturaleza al ver que tu belleza no es algo que se pueda arruinar. Y una prueba más nos brindó el destino
para poder dar la mano al vecino.
Y unidos en oraciones, agradecer que estamos vivos. Isla bendita, los ángeles te consuelan, tu pueblo precioso grita ese coro. Isla bendita, por eso tienes vuelas, tu gente nunca se quita.
Isla Bendita, Blessed Island, sung by many Latin artists, including Juan Luis Guerra and Luis Fonsi, to raise funds for Hurricane Maria victims in Puerto Rico. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end the show with Puerto Rico. 1 year after Hurricane Maria killed thousands and caused the longest blackout in U.S. history. Last week, President Trump generated widespread criticism when he falsely claimed on Twitter 3,000 people did not die in 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. When I left the island after the storm had hit, they had anywhere from 6 to 18 deaths. As time went by, it did not go up by much. Then a long time later, they started to report really large numbers, like 3,000. He went on to tweet, this was done by Democrats in order to make me look as bad as possible when I was successfully raising billions of dollars to help rebuild Puerto Rico. If a person died for any reason like old age, just add them onto the list. Bad politics. I love Puerto Rico. Trump's comments came after Puerto Rico's governor formally updated the death toll from Hurricane Maria to 2,975 people, citing multiple news outlets and universities that showed thousands of people died during the days and weeks after the storm. A Harvard study estimated the death toll may have topped 4,600.
Meanwhile, on Monday, President Trump declared himself an absolute no on statehood for Puerto Rico as long as San Juan's mayor, Carmen Yulín Cruz, is in office. Cruz has been a major critic of President Trump's response to Maria. Trump spoke in an interview with Geraldo Rivera in Cleveland.
With a mayor of San Juan as bad as she is and as incompetent as she is, Puerto Rico shouldn't be talking about statehood until they get some people that really know what they're doing. With people like that involved in Puerto Rico, I would be an absolute no. If you had people like the mayor of San Juan, whatever her name may be, she is a horror show. She was so bad and so disrespectful to our military, to our first responders, and to our great FEMA people who did a phenomenal job.
Well, for more, we're joined by Naomi Klein, author of the book, The Battle for Paradise. Puerto Rico takes on the disaster capitalist. She's senior correspondent at The Intercept, where her recent article is headlined, "There's Nothing Natural About Puerto Rico's Disaster." She's also the new inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair of Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. Congratulations on your new post, Naomi, Professor Klein. And welcome back to Democracy Now! Naomi is joining us from Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where Juan also teaches.
Yes, and we're delighted to have Naomi with us at Rutgers now, and also she's in my department as well in journalism and media studies.
So speaking of journalism, media studies, and Puerto Rico, Naomi, why don't we begin with these two different controversies that President Trump has created by questioning the numbers of people who died in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and then saying he would never support statehood as long as Mayor Cruz is the San Juan mayor.
Absolutely, Amy and Juan, it's wonderful to be with you. So I don't think we should be terribly surprised by the fact that Donald Trump is denying hard reality. He did this beginning on his very first day in office, denying the accounts of the size of the crowd, and he denies the reality of climate change. So he denies inconvenient facts, both small and large. And now he is denying the reality that Hurricane Maria was the catalyst for thousands of people losing their lives. You mentioned the 3,000 figure. Many Puerto Ricans are convinced that that is very low, that at the end of the day we're going to find out that the number could well be more than twice that. And the accounting, he talks about old age and so on. This is absolutely not true. What these very credible studies have shown from several universities, and also now the government in Puerto Rico is saying that this is legitimate, is that people lost their lives for multiple reasons, not just the wind and the storm itself, but the total failure of the infrastructure. And maybe we can come back to that. But people lost their lives because they weren't able to plug in life-saving medical equipment. They lost their lives because basic medicine was not available to them because the healthcare system collapsed. The whole public infrastructure of Puerto Rico collapsed, and that's not just about Trump. That is part of a bipartisan war that has been waged on the public sphere in Puerto Rico using the debt as the excuse. Now, when it comes to the attacks on the mayor of San Juan, it's really striking because many of the worst examples, the most lethal examples of the failure of relief efforts in Puerto Rico were outside of San Juan. I mean, not to say that things went well in San Juan, but the world was introduced to Mayor Cruz because she was wading through the waters trying to help people, a very different model of leadership than Donald Trump, waiting so long before going to Puerto Rico, then tossing paper towels, right? So he always saw her as a threat. But the worst accounts that we heard after the hurricane had to do with communities, that were more isolated. Places like Ajuntas, Orikovich, Mariana, where it was weeks before there was any visit from FEMA, and then when they finally, somebody came, they were offered Skittles and, Cheez-It crackers. So it wasn't, the worst, and it was months and months before places like Vieques got power at all. So this is really a distraction by focusing on Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz, and it is, I think, really about him banking on the misogyny of his base. He has made it very clear the type of woman that he likes. These are women who stay silent and loyal for the most part. And he's trying to cast Mayor Cruz as, a loudmouth Latina woman who doesn't know her place. And he's hoping that this will be sufficient distraction from his own failures.
Well, and Naomi, on that point, even Governor Ricky Rosselló, who is obviously in a different political party from Carmen Yulín Cruz, criticized the president's remarks toward the mayor. Interestingly, and this hasn't gotten much attention here in the United States, but there's apparently a federal grand jury has been convening in San Juan, looking into alleged corruption within the San Juan municipal government. They've been taking testimony now for several days, and the press reports have started to surface. So not so surprisingly, suddenly the federal government is launching a corruption investigation into the San Juan mayor's office. And also that when President Trump talks about he's not supporting statehood because of people like the mayor of San Juan is not part of the government apparatus of the overall Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. She has nothing to do with it. She's a mayor of a local city. So the idea that you would penalize an entire population by not supporting statehood, not to say that all Puerto Ricans or even a majority of Puerto Ricans want statehood, but just to target this issue of statehood just because you have a disagreement with the local mayor is really astounding. But I think goes along the line of what you're saying about him not wanting to have any kind of challenge from a woman politician.
Yeah, and incidentally, she's been very clear that she herself doesn't support statehood. That's not her political position. But I think, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on this, Juan. You know, I also think that if we look at what has happened after the storm and also what was happening before, there's been this huge influx of hedge fund managers, cryptocurrency dudes who are flocking to Puerto Rico for part of the year, but establishing residency there to take advantage of this buffet of tax incentives that is being offered to them. You know, they are able to pay no federal income tax, but they're also able to pay no tax on dividends, you know, no tax on interest, no capital gains taxes. So it seems to me that the profitability of Puerto Rico for the very wealthy in the United States really has to do with its exceptionality, with its colonial status. So I think that may actually be the reason why Donald Trump isn't interested in statehood, perhaps.
I wanted to turn to an event you went to, Juan, on Friday. You gave a keynote address at Rutgers Newark. And before that, Rutgers held a panel on the PROMESA Control Board and the debt crisis with a member of Puerto Rico's PROMESA Control Board, Arthur Gonzalez, from NYU Law School. He was joined by Natasha Orobanen from, her name is?
Natasha Alicia.
Yeah, Alicia Orobanen from Latino Justice Pearl Duff. This is a part of their exchange.
The board has publicly said on several occasions that their goal is to turn Puerto Rico into the Singapore or Hong Kong of the Caribbean.
When did the board have said that?
Members of the board have said that, and I.
No, let's clarify. No, this is not. If you're going to say the board said something, you really need, I think, to try to be accurate.
Well, members of the board said that in their capacity as a member of the board. Right, have said that. They've said that in public spaces, in their capacity as a member of the board, not in any individual capacity, have said, you know, we want to make sure Puerto Rico becomes the Hong Kong of the Caribbean, the Singapore of the Caribbean. What does it mean to being a Singapore or Hong Kong of the Caribbean? Are we talking about an elitist space, a high wealth income space where only those that can afford to live there are able to live there, and where those who are poor being pushed out? I mean, I think that those are extremely problematic comments that signal what the vision of the board or members of the board have, that in their, you know, and being entrusted by Congress to enact an economic vision is one that is not shared by 3.5 million individuals.
So that's Natasha Orobanen from Latino Justice Pearl Duff and Arthur Gonzalez, who's on the PROMESA Control Board, won the significance of this.
Well, Arthur Gonzalez very rarely speaks in public, especially as a representative of the PROMESA Control Board. The fact that he was there and that he was willing to participate is allowed for people to be able to challenge some of the perspectives of the Control Board directly. And I raised the point that a huge report that the Control Board produced on August 20th about the roots of the financial crisis, that the Control Board never used the subpoena power, really, that they had, that Congress gave them, to call in these bankers and these other folks on the record to talk to find out what the possible corruption basis of a lot of the debt of Puerto Rico was. Instead, they relied on voluntary testimony. They took no transcripts of the interviews they did with over 120 people, and they didn't interview people under sworn testimony. So in reality, the report ends up being a whitewash. And I'd like to ask Naomi, in the little time that we have left, where do you think Puerto Rico goes from here?
Well, Juan, as you know, the proceeds from the book Amy mentioned, The Battle for Paradise, all of it goes to an amazing political coalition in Puerto Rico called Junta Gente. People can look it up at juntagente.org. It's 60 organizations that have been fighting austerity, privatization, and also advancing a very different economic and political vision for the islands that is really grounded in deep sovereignty. So not only political sovereignty, but food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty, a transition and a response to Maria that treats it like the wake-up call that it should be, so that the way in which Puerto Rico recovers actually get at the root causes for its vulnerability. So that
we want to thank you, Naomi, for being with us. That does it for the show. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.